In 19 AD, a Roman noblewoman named Vestilia, daughter of a praetor, walked into the aedile's office in Rome and publicly registered herself as a prostitute, because registered prostitutes were the only women in the empire legally exempt from prosecution for adultery. Read that again. She didn't fall into the trade. She didn't get caught and dragged in. She walked in. She gave her name. She paid the fee. She took the license. And she did it because the Roman state had built a loophole so absurd that the safest legal status for a married aristocratic woman who wanted to sleep with men outside her marriage was the official status of whore. Tacitus records the moment in the Annals, Book 2, Chapter 85, with the dry contempt of a man who cannot believe what he is writing. Suetonius backs him up. The Senate convened in panic. The Emperor Tiberius was furious. Within weeks, they would pass an emergency decree to slam the loophole shut forever. Forget the marble, forget the togas. The story that follows is not about Roman vice. It is about Roman paperwork. And the paperwork—
You were taught Rome tolerated prostitution. That is wrong. Rome administered it. There was a desk, there was a clerk, there was a ledger. The office belonged to the aediles, the same magistrates who inspected your bread weights and your wine measures. And a woman entering the trade was required by law to appear in person, state her name, her father's name, her age, and her chosen working name, and to receive a license in return. That license came as a physical object, a small token, sometimes clay, sometimes lead, called a tessera, and you carried it on you. Lose the tessera, and you were not a prostitute anymore. You were an unlicensed criminal. Once your name went into the ledger, it did not come out, ever. There was no quitting. Even if you stopped working, even if you married, the Roman state kept your name on the list of the infames, the infamous, for the rest of your life. You forfeited the right to wear the stola of a respectable woman. You forfeited the right to inherit. You forfeited the right to bring most legal cases in court. But here is the part the textbooks skip. What did the state give you in return?
It gave you immunity. Specifically, immunity from the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, Augustus's adultery law, passed in 18 BC, which had turned the bedroom of every Roman wife into a potential courtroom. Under that law, a husband was legally required to divorce and prosecute an unfaithful wife, or face charges himself for procuring. Conviction meant exile to a barren island, confiscation of half her dowry, and the lifelong stigma of infamia. But the law had a carve-out. It could not apply to women already classed as infames. A registered prostitute could not commit adultery, because the Roman legal mind had decided her body was already public. You cannot steal what is already given away. So Vestilia, of senatorial blood, daughter of a praetor, wife of a Roman knight, did the math. She walked to the aedile's office in 19 AD and registered. She bought herself, with the stroke of a stylus, total legal immunity for whatever she did next. And the Senate, when they heard, did not.
The Senatus Consultum that followed is one of the strangest pieces of legislation in Roman history. It did not punish Vestilia for sleeping around. It punished her for the registration itself. Henceforth, the Senate decreed no woman whose grandfather, father, or husband held the rank of Roman knight could legally register as a prostitute. The loophole was sealed by class. Patrician women were now forbidden from being whores, not for moral reasons, but for legal engineering reasons. Vestilia herself was exiled to the Greek island of Seriphos. Her husband was charged with failing to prosecute her and only escaped by claiming he had been within the 60-day window the law allowed. Read what the Senate did, and you read a confession. They admitted, on the record, that the Roman state had been running a registration system so functional that an aristocrat could exploit it. They did not abolish the system. They restricted access to it. The brothels stayed open. The ledgers stayed in the aedil's office. The tesserae kept being stamped. Only the clientele of the registrar changed. And here is what almost no later Roman historian wanted to say out loud. The system Vistilia exploited was not a back-alley scandal.
In 40 AD, the Emperor Caligula did something his predecessors had only flirted with. He nationalized the income. Suetonius records it in chapter 40 of his Life of Caligula with a single shocked sentence. A tax was imposed on the earnings of prostitutes, calculated as the price of a single act per worker per day, collected directly into the imperial treasury. The Latin name was vectigal ex capturis, and it was collected by an imperial procurator, a personal financial officer of the emperor, not by a city magistrate. Think about what that means. The income of every registered lupa in the empire, from Pompeii to Alexandria to Roman Britain, was now flowing up a pipeline that ended in the emperor's private purse. The tax outlived Caligula. It outlived his assassination. Vespasian kept it. Domitian kept it. It was still being collected in the 3rd century, when Alexander Severus tried briefly to redirect the revenue to the upkeep of public buildings. A Roman emperor literally proposing to repair the Colosseum with whore tax. The proposal failed. Why? Because you are walking through Pompeii. It is a Tuesday afternoon in the year 70 AD. You pass the central baths, the Stabian baths, and you turn left into a narrow side street called the Vicolo del Lupanare. Within 30 paces, you are standing in front of a 2-story building with 5 small rooms on the ground floor, each barely big enough for a stone bed. The doorways are low. The walls are painted with explicit frescoes, a menu, scholars now think, for customers who didn't speak Latin. This is the Lupanar, Regio 7, Insula 12. It is the only purpose-built brothel from the Roman world that survives intact, because in 79 AD, Vesuvius buried it under 20 feet of ash before anyone could tear it down or repurpose it. But here is what the tourists are not told. The Lupanar's location is not an accident. Roman law confined registered prostitution to specific zones, near the public baths, near the gladiatorial schools, near the city gates and the docks. The aediles drew the lines. Build a brothel outside the zone and it would be demolished. Build one inside and you paid a separate rent to the building's owner, who was usually a respectable citizen, collecting on
And then there are the walls. Roughly 150 inscriptions are still legible on the plaster of the Lupanar, and they are not what you expect. They are reviews, customer reviews, scratched into the wall in the cramped, illiterate hand of the average Roman man on his lunch break. They name the women: Myrtis, Felicla, Drauca, Mola, Successa, Fortunata. They list prices: 2 asses, 8 asses, 16 asses. An ass was a small bronze coin. At the time of the eruption, a loaf of bread cost roughly 2 asses. A cup of average wine cost 1. So the lower end of the price scale is, with brutal mathematical clarity, the price of a single loaf of bread. They rate performance. One graffito calls a woman Drauca, and another, scratched lower down on the same wall, claims a man named Harpocras had sex with her for a denarius, 16 asses, and says she was worth every coin. Another simply records, "I screwed many girls here. Hic ego puellas multas futui." These are not the words of poets. They are not the words of moralists. They are the words of customers. And they survived because the volcano sealed them in place faster than the Roman state.
You should not romanticize the names on the wall.
The vast majority of these women, Myrtis, Felicla, Drauca, all of them, were slaves. The Roman trade in human beings fed the Roman trade in sex, and the two were inseparable. A lupa in a state-zoned cell in Pompeii was almost certainly the property of the brothel's owner, sold into it as a child or captured in war as an adult. She did not keep the asses. The asses went to the master. The tessera was issued in her name, but her body was not legally hers to control. Roman law made one exception. If a slave woman could prove her master had sold her into prostitution after promising her freedom, she could sue for manumission and win. Almost none did. Most could not read the ledger that bound them, could not afford the lawyer that would file the case, and would not survive the master's retaliation if they tried. The freeborn prostitutes, the ones who entered voluntarily, like Vistilia at the extreme end, like a tavern keeper's daughter at the ordinary end, were a small minority. The system ran on enslaved labor. The tax flowed up to the emperor. The graffiti named the women. And then, for 1800 years, Rome fell. The church rose. And the writers who copied and recopied the surviving manuscripts of Tacitus and Suetonius were monks, men with strong opinions about what should and should not be preserved. The passages about Vistilia survived because the censors at the monastery scriptoria did not always read carefully, and because Tacitus and Suetonius were canonical authors. But the institutional knowledge of the system, the operating manuals, the aediles procedural handbooks, the texts of the registration statutes, the records of the tessera workshops, the procurator's tax collection ledgers, all of that vanished. Not lost, erased. The medieval and early modern compilers of Roman law preserved the marriage statutes, the inheritance statutes, the slavery statutes, the property statutes. They did not preserve the prostitution statutes. The Renaissance antiquarians who began excavating Rome in the 15th century recorded temples and forums and triumphal arches. They did not record the cellae. Until 1748. That year, a Spanish engineer working for the King of Naples drove a shaft into a hillside near a town called Resina, and the lost city of Pompeii. When the first excavators reached the lupanar in the 1860s, the Bourbon government of Naples ordered the building locked. Tourists were not allowed in. Photographs were forbidden. The frescoes were too explicit. The graffiti was too vulgar. The very existence of a purpose-built, state-zoned, customer-reviewed brothel sat too uncomfortably next to the polite 19th-century image of noble Rome that European elites had built their educations on. The lupanar was sealed and quietly forgotten a second time. It did not fully reopen to the public until the late 20th century. The graffiti were finally catalogued line by line in Volume 4 of the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, the great Berlin compendium of Latin inscriptions. And only then did the scale of the surviving evidence become clear. 150 graffiti, 5 purpose-built cellae, the names of dozens of women, the prices in asses, the customers' boasts and complaints, and the volcanic ash that had refused for nearly 2 millennia to let any of it be erased. The ash did what the historians would not. So here is what the bureaucracy actually looked like, reassembled from 4 surviving fragments. A woman entered the trade by appearing before the aediles. She gave her name and was issued a tessera. Her name was added to a list that could never be cleansed. She was assigned, by law, to a zone, near the baths, near the gates, near the games. The cellae she worked in was rented, owned by a respectable citizen, often staffed by enslaved women he had purchased for the purpose. Every day she worked, a portion of her earnings, calculated as the price of one act, was owed to an imperial procurator, and flowed, eventually, into the emperor's purse. Customers wrote on the walls. The Senate occasionally panicked, as in 19 AD, and tightened the rules at the edges. The system was not hidden. It was, in the original Latin sense of the word, public, publica. And then, slowly, deliberately, the official memory of it was scraped off the record by the writers who came after, until the only place the system could still be read was a buried street in a buried town.
If you remember one thing from this episode, remember this. Civilizations do not always hide their taboos. Sometimes they license them, tax them, zone them, and stamp little clay tokens for them. And then it is the historians who do the hiding, not the lawmakers. Vistilia did not invent the loophole, she used it. The Senate did not abolish the brothels, they restricted the registry. Caligula did not invent the tax, he centralized it. And the monks did not destroy the evidence, they simply chose not to copy it. The next time someone tells you a society's official record is the whole record, ask yourself what volcano would have to erupt to bring back the rest. Vesuvius did the Romans the brutal favor of preserving what they would have preferred to forget. Most civilizations do not get a Vesuvius. Most of what they buried stays buried. And the polite version of the past, the togas, the marble, the senate, the orators, is the one we end up teaching, because the ash never came for the inconvenient parts. If you found this useful, the next one digs into something else they buried.